Part 1 of this biography will be looking at Vladimir Putin's early life and his days in the KGB. What events shaped his early life? What was he like in his youth? And what exactly did this former KGB agent experience that led to the president we know today? Whether it be Russian intervention in Crimea or the support for Assad in Syria, Putin has created the image of an Eastern European strongman capable of pursuing his interests both ruthlessly and calculatingly. Was the man we see today an extension of the younger self, or is the political persona constructed something completely different? We must begin our journey, though, in the very beginning, in the heart of Leningrad. Born on October 7th, 1952, the future KGB officer and second president of Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, was born in Leningrad, modern-day Saint Petersburg. While Vladimir's parents were able to stay together throughout his life, they'd suffered greatly with grief, having already lost two sons, Viktor and Albert Putin, before young Vladimir. Albert had died in infancy, and Viktor during the Siege of Leningrad. At the time of Vladimir's birth, Stalin was the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union, yet the Stalinist era of communism was coming to an end as the tyrant died the following year. Putin spent his youth predominantly in a world where the next leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, sought to reverse the dreadful atrocities of Stalin through his sweeping anti-Stalinist reforms of not only the economy, but the whole political structure of the USSR. By chance, they were to transform the opportunities of young children like Vladimir across the Soviet Union, as children from poorer or proletariat backgrounds were promoted as the future leaders of tomorrow. The Soviet Union was a superpower at this time, as the young boy entered his early years, but Leningrad itself still bore the scars of the bitter battles fought during World War II, and while Vladimir's parents also had bore their personal cost. As such, while the city struggled to rebuild after the devastation of war, the conditions growing up can only be described as poor and tough on young Vladimir. It was a city in which the biggest and strongest dominated and preyed on the weak. Vladimir was not the biggest or the strongest child, but the rough neighbourhood was enough to make the boy a troublemaker. Indeed, when he began school in September 1960, he was an average student, but one teachers found highly disruptive both inside and outside the classroom. Once caught with a knife, young Vladimir struggled to socially integrate with his classmates, choosing instead to hang around with the more thuggish children, such as two brothers called Kovshov. Due to his behaviour, he was excluded along with 5 others from the Young Pioneers, a young communist organisation which at the time was considered fundamental for the future prospects of these young children. Vladimir himself confesses to being badly behaved in his youth in an interview where he said, "I was more a hooligan than a pioneer." It was at this point that his parents realised that they need to do something to straighten out this out-of-control boy. Therefore, in 1965, aged 13, he joined a martial arts club which practised sambo, a popular Soviet style of judo at the time. The lessons he learned at that club would forever stay with him until the present day. While his father initially wanted him to take up boxing, his parents could have no complaints as his teacher Rakhilin installed a strong sense of discipline in Vladimir. Sambo finally allowed him to find a way to defend himself against the older and bigger children, whilst also installing a sense of responsibility within him. His grades began to improve, and eventually he was admitted to his school's pioneer branch, going on to a leadership role within the organisation. Now with the discipline and attitude enforced through rigorous sambo training, Vladimir needed an idea of what to do with his life. That vision of his future came from a film called The Shield and Sword. The film, released in 1968, was about a Soviet spy undercover in Nazi Germany, sabotaging the German war effort behind enemy lines. The film inspired the young Vladimir into wanting to be like his hero, and he began to envision a future for himself being a KGB spy. Inspired by the film's protagonist, at the tender age of 15, Putin walked into his local KGB headquarters and volunteered his service. Unfortunately, the officer meeting this young boy told him that the KGB did not accept volunteers, selecting its elite from those in the army or at university instead. He advised Vladimir to go to law school, work hard, and that would be his best chance to get in. Vladimir took his advice, studying hard, and whilst his grades were not overtly impressive, he got into the prestigious Leningrad State University. There is much speculation as to whether this meeting helped Vladimir get in, especially given how he was not an exceptional student, but it seems we'll never actually know the truth given the secrecy around the Soviet Union at the time. After spending 4 years at this university studying law and having his first relationship, coincidentally with a young girl who had shared the name of his future wife, He was eventually approached to join the KGB aged 23. It's worth noting at this point that Vladimir had managed to straighten himself out, or at least in the eyes of his peers. While not losing his ruthlessness, he became much more organised and disciplined. He lived a healthy lifestyle, choosing not to drink or smoke, but instead exercised regularly through sambo. Politically, it's very hard to find an ideological core to him at this point. It appears reasonable to conclude his motivation for joining the KGB is to some degree drawn from the patriotism inspired by the shield and sword. Vladimir was more of a successful product of the Soviet propaganda machine than anything else. He was drawn to the law and order aspect of the system rather than the communist belief. In the 1960s, after the Khrushchev reforms preceding the death of Stalin, the utopianism of the early communist era had begun to die off and bureaucracy had taken its place. Eventually, in 1964, after he was widely perceived to have botched the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was overthrown. Communism as a whole was stagnating as an idea and bitterly locked within the Cold War with the United States, while other communist states such as China began to distance themselves from the Soviet Union politically. The idealised and ambitious reform packages, such as the 5-year plans, had long since taken a backseat, and institutions like the KGB were there to provide control and order domestically, rather than actively promote their own communist visions of tomorrow. If Vladimir had been ideologically asphyxiated by communist ideas, and wanted a career within politics, he could have attempted to climb the greasy pole of the Communist Party hierarchy. The fact he chose not to speaks volumes of how little politics at this point was a motivation in his life. Furthermore, Vladimir would have made the right kind of recruit for the KGB at the time, given his personal qualities, but in addition his actions at 15 had shown he was loyal and committed to the institution itself. Putin was now a KGB agent in body and mind. Putin initially worked from the KGB in counterintelligence, collecting a network of spies and informants from abroad. After 6 months of this work, he was moved to the KGB's first chief directive, widely regarded as the elite section of the KGB. He was now responsible for monitoring foreign diplomats and general visitors. In 1979, he was promoted to the rank of captain and sent for training at the KGB High School after returning again to his previous role. While working at the KGB, Putin went on to meet his now former wife Lyudmila, who at the time was working as an air hostess. They met through a friend, but as an insight towards his rather cold and unforgiving character, after dating for a while, the proposal came as a complete surprise to Lyudmila, who informed friends that she was half expecting to break up with her when he proposed. It seems, however, that Putin was marrying more for career progression than anything else. At the KGB, older bachelors were suspect, and married men were seen as much more reliable for missions. They married on the 28th of July 1983 and had their first daughter, Maria, born in Leningrad, on the 28th of April 1985. Outside of work, former associates of Putin found him during this time of his life to be temperamental and indifferent towards risk. For example, a former associate, Roel Dugan, recalls the story of how Putin was approached by a few drunk students on a return from a church tour for a cigarette. He proceeded not only to refuse them, but shoved one and proceeded to throw him over his shoulder like a judo move. Such behaviour is reckless given his association with the secret police and the implications this could have had on his career. Luckily for Putin, none of this seems to have been picked up on by the KGB, for by the time he was 33, in 1985, after the birth of his first daughter, he was to be given his first international assignment, stationed in Dresden in the German Democratic Republic, the communist-controlled area of East Germany. Now Major Putin, having gone through further training, was to work alongside the German Stasi, who did most of the political intelligence work within the communist satellite state. Relying on the skills he developed in Dresden, he recruited informants from which he built up a knowledge of the economic, political and military capabilities of the West. Throughout his time in Dresden, the Cold War and the inevitable collapse of communism was nearing. Indeed, the political systems long upheld by institutions like the KGB were beginning to suffer from economic stagnation and rebellion from the satellite states vying for independence from the Soviet Union. The work undertook by Putin and his colleagues on the whole was a complete waste of time, as the information provided was relatively basic and useless to the communist cause. As his wife joined him in Dresden, they had their second daughter, Ekaterina, on the 31st of August 1986. During his time in Dresden, Putin had begun to succumb to the temptations of the West, enjoying the relative luxuries and comforts brought by Western informants and colleagues. Such gifts given to him from his various informants include car radios and denim jeans, a highly sought-after commodity in the Soviet Union. Whilst his commanding officer took a shine to him and Putin was once again promoted, his career began to stagnate and he gave up practicing judo. He began to drink beer and start to indulge in an unhealthy lifestyle which previously he had worked so hard to avoid. Given the collapsing world around him, is it any wonder that he started to divert away from the discipline and direction installed in him, given that his dream future had all but disappeared? He was not the spy in the shield and sword, undercover behind enemy lines, but just another KGB officer living in Dresden supporting a dying administration. He was married to a system that had failed him, and, after being born into humble backgrounds of Leningrad, this Western capitalist delights provided a corrupting influence. As Masha Gessen alleges, Putin liked having things, whether it be the car his mother had won in a lottery in Leningrad that Putin spent his days in university driving around in, or the Western clothing throughout his life. Now coming into the final years of the direct service to the KGB, this case officer had become gluttonous, greedy, and lost direction to his life, allowing the vices to decay his character. 1989 would provide the death toll for communism and drag Putin into the front line for the first time. As the German Democratic Republic no longer had the ability to repress people, partly due to Gorbachev's position on softening the authoritarian wheels of the East German state, protests demanding democracy and freedom starting in October suddenly overwhelmed the satellite state. Eventually, the communist authorities could only look on in horror as the Berlin Wall collapsed on the 9th of November, after the traction of these protests had led to the German Democratic Republic conceding that East Germans would be allowed to cross over into West Berlin. No sooner had the words been uttered than it caused a rush on the wall and for it to be pulled down. While the Soviet Union would last another 2 years, this is widely regarded as the final nail in the coffin of communism and the death of the Soviet Union as a superpower. Putin himself watched on as the system he'd given his life to all but disappeared before his eyes. Communism had lost, the West had won. The protests across East Germany continued into December, and on the 5th, thousands gathered outside the Stasi headquarters in Dresden. Lieutenant Colonel Putin, as he was now known, surveyed them from the fringes of the compound. At 5 o'clock, the leaders opened the gate and protesters stormed inside, destroying the headquarters. After watching the takeover, Putin immediately rushed to the KGB mansion he worked at, just as a breakaway group gathered outside the building. Putin was now the only senior officer there, with 4 other officers at 9 o'clock, the last line of defence sitting on KGB files, datas and secrets. He ordered them to be ready for attack while calling the Soviet military command at Dresden, demanding reinforcements. Given the bureaucratic structures of the military, they could do absolutely nothing without approval from Moscow, but Moscow was silent. No help would be on its way. The protection of the KGB outpost was his alone, along with the 4 other officers. Putin decided to play a courageous bluff and emerged from the mansion to inform the protesters that the building was guarded and they would shoot anybody who tried to storm the building before retreating into the all but empty mansion. The protesters, having already toppled the Stasi in Dresden, decided that the threat was credible and proceeded to disperse, not wanting bloodshed. The bluff had worked. The KGB outpost was protected, but Putin would forever be scarred by that night and the fear of mob rule. For him, the fall of the Stasi had proved that the mob could sweep all before it and provide chaos to the law and order that kept the system in place. Throughout his political career, this fear would continue to haunt his decision-making, ensuring he would never take chances with regards to people. They must be controlled, otherwise mob rule would potentially destroy anything and everything before him in a blink of an eye. That was the real threat to society. In the next few months, as Germany completed reunification, Putin and the rest of the KGB began to destroy all documents and information they'd spent the years gathering. Fearing it could implicate not only their informants, but also themselves, they hastily disposed of anything and everything they could lay their hands on. The furnace used even proceeded to break down from burning too many documents at once. Putin's time as a foreign agent was at its end in February 1990 as the KGB withdrew from the former German Democratic Republic. Packing his life back into boxes alongside his wife and 2 young daughters, Putin moved back in with his parents in Leningrad. While still being part of the KGB, he was never likely to be given another direct assignment, given the sheer number of people returning from the various satellite states. The exodus had left Putin back where it began, albeit in better accommodation than before, as his parents had moved into a much more spacious apartment. He was now very much a KGB reserve, deprived of a stable income and a job, with a family to support, having watched the service he devoted his life to crumble before him. However, as one door closes, another one opens. With his life as a foreign spy over, his political career that would lead him to the highest echelons of power was only just about to begin. Throughout history, some of the most powerful Russian and Soviet political figures have emerged not from the higher classes, but from the lower classes of society. Whilst Putin may not have been raised by a single parent like Stalin, or endured the execution of an older sibling like Lenin, there can be little question that he grew up in a rough neighbourhood to poor parents. He suffered greatly as a result in the early stages of his childhood, becoming badly behaved and engaging in unruly behaviour, but sambo, which would remain with him throughout his life, would become his saving grace. The martial arts taught him to be disciplined, and eventually the young boy became a successful product of the Soviet propaganda machine, being motivated to join the KGB by the Shield and Sword film. However, he never lost the risk-taking trait he learnt in the streets in Leningrad. Starting off as a KGB agent in Leningrad, he did manage to fulfill his dream of becoming a Soviet spy abroad, stationed in Dresden, yet given the proximity to the end of the Cold War, their life was not as fulfilling as he expected it to be. Instead, he was corrupted by the temptations of the West and gripped with the desire to own things, briefly giving up judo and letting himself slide into an unhealthy lifestyle. At the end of the Cold War, he showed himself to be a capable leader and tactically astute, saving his KGB outpost the day the Stasi fell in Dresden. Putin, back in Leningrad, was a much older man now at 37, but lacked direction in his life. Contrary to what he probably believed at the time, his time at the KGB was not wasted. Many of the skills he gained from his time would serve him well in politics.